The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath a sky streaked with copper and gold as dawn broke over the waters southeast of Bougainville. November 1943. The air smelled of salt and diesel fuel, and the sea rolled in slow, deliberate swells that made the steel hulls of the American task force creak and groan like living things. Aboard the cruiser USS Denver, sailors in sweat-stained dungarees moved through their morning routines with the mechanical precision of men who'd learned to function on too little sleep and too much coffee. Captain Robert Briscoe stood on the bridge, binoculars pressed against his weathered face, scanning the eastern horizon. The sun climbed higher, turning the ocean into a sheet of molten glass. Beautiful. Deceptive. He'd been in these waters long enough to know that beauty meant nothing out here. The Pacific didn't care about beauty. It cared about steel, fire, and who could deliver violence faster. "Sir, radar reports clear," said Lieutenant Morrison, clipboard in hand, young face already lined with the exhaustion that came from months of convoy duty. "Air cover confirms they're on station. 8 Wildcats circling at Angels 15. Briscoe nodded without lowering his binoculars. 8 fighters. Against what the Japanese could throw at them, 8 might as well be 8 toy planes. But Command said it was enough. Command was sitting in Pearl Harbor, 3,000 miles away, drinking real coffee and sleeping in actual beds. The task force, 5 cruisers, 8 destroyers, moving in formation like a school of mechanical fish, was tasked with interdicting Japanese supply runs down the slot, that deadly stretch of water between the Solomon Islands where destroyers raced under cover of darkness, delivering troops and supplies to garrisons that refused to die. The Tokyo Express, the Americans called it. The Rat Run. The sailors had darker names for it. Con, this is radar. Contact bearing 045, range 40 miles. Multiple bogeys. Count is. Jesus, sir, count is 30 plus. The bridge went silent. 30 plus. The coffee cup in Morrison's hand stopped halfway to his lips. Briscoe's jaw tightened. Sound General Quarters. Get those Wildcats vectored in. Now. The alarm shrieked through the ship, a sound that sent ice through every man's veins. Boots hammered on steel decks. Hatches slammed. Gun crews sprinted to their stations, 5-inch mounts swiveling toward the distant sky. Down in the engine rooms, men who couldn't see the enemy or the ocean gripped their tools tighter, feeling the ship's acceleration through the soles of their feet as the turbines screamed to flank speed. Above them, somewhere in that brightening sky, 30 Japanese aircraft were closing in. Betty bombers, probably. Maybe Vals. The Japanese had learned, adapted, evolved. They'd watched the Americans sink their carriers at Midway, watched their fleet crumble at Guadalcanal, and they'd drawn one simple conclusion: if you can't win on the water, win from the air. "All stations report manned and ready, sir," Morrison said, voice steady despite the white knuckles gripping his clipboard. Briscoe raised his binoculars again. The horizon remained empty, mocking. But somewhere out there, props were spinning, bomb bay doors were open, and young men in leather flight suits were adjusting their goggles and whispering prayers in Japanese. "Signal the task force," Briscoe said quietly. "Prepare for aerial assault. Maintain formation. Weapons free." The radioman's voice crackled across the tactical net. All ships, this is Denver. Bogies inbound from northeast. Estimate 28 minutes to contact. Weapons free. Good hunting. 28 minutes. Lieutenant Morrison stared at the radar screen, watching the cluster of contacts crawl closer, impossibly patient, impossibly steady. "Sir, do you think the fighters can?" "No," Briscoe interrupted. "Not cruel. Just honest. 8 against 30? They'll take down a few. Maybe buy us 3, 4 minutes. After that, it's us and them." The younger officer swallowed hard. Briscoe turned to face his crew. Young faces, old eyes. Men from Kansas and Georgia and Oregon and New York, boys who'd signed up thinking they'd see the world. They'd seen it, all right. They'd seen men burn alive in oil fires. They'd seen ships break in half and swallow 500 souls in 90 seconds. They'd seen things no recruitment poster ever showed. "Listen up," Briscoe called out, voice carrying across the bridge. "They're coming in heavy. They'll come in low and fast, or high and spread out. Doesn't matter. What matters is that we throw up more steel than they can fly through. You keep those guns singing, and we keep floating. Simple math. Simple math." Nothing about this was simple. The task force tightened its formation, ships drawing closer together, overlapping fields of fire creating a lattice of death that anything trying to penetrate would have to survive. It was doctrine. It was logic. And it had worked before. But that was before the Japanese learned to send 30 planes at once. High above, the Combat Air Patrol, 8 Grumman F-4F Wildcats, climbed hard, engines roaring, pilots scanning the sky with the intensity of men whose friends were floating in metal coffins below. Squadron leader Lieutenant Dan Fletcher thumbed his radio. "Blue flight. This is Blue leader. Tally-ho inbound. Looks like Betty's. Maybe some escort. Stay tight, pick your shots, make them count." His wingman, Ensign Tommy Reeves, 22 years old, farm boy from Iowa, checked his gun sight and felt his pulse hammering in his throat. 30 against 8. He'd done the math too. Different numbers, same conclusion. Below, on the Denver, a gunner's mate named Jackson pressed his forehead against the cool steel of the 5-inch mount and whispered a prayer his grandmother had taught him. Around him, shells were being loaded, breeches slammed shut, traversing gears tested. The whole ship had become a single breathing weapon, waiting. The Japanese formation appeared first as specks against the clouds, tiny imperfections in the sky's canvas. Then they grew. Fast. 26 minutes now. Briscoe felt the deck vibrate beneath his feet as the Denver's engines pushed harder. The destroyers on the flanks began weaving, serpentine patterns designed to complicate bombing runs. Smart. But if the Japanese had torpedoes, those patterns might mean nothing. "Fighters engaging," someone shouted. Through his binoculars, Briscoe watched the tiny shapes merge, separate, tumble. Tracers stitched the sky in brilliant arcs. Something exploded, a fireball blossoming orange and black, debris tumbling toward the sea. Japanese or American, he couldn't tell from here. Didn't matter. Someone's sun just stopped existing. The Wildcats dove and climbed, firing in short, disciplined bursts. One Betty bomber shuddered, trailing smoke, falling away from formation. Another staggered, engine aflame, but kept coming. Brave bastards. Briscoe almost admired them. But admiration didn't stop bullets. "Range 20,000 yards and closing," radar called out. The sky ahead began to fill with dark shapes, growing larger, more distinct. Twin-engine bombers in tight V formations, some with torpedoes slung beneath their bellies like pregnant sharks. Behind them, higher up, the glint of Zero fighters waiting to pounce on anything that rose to challenge. "All batteries," Briscoe said into the comm, "commence firing." And the world erupted. Every 5-inch gun on every ship in the task force opened up simultaneously, a thunderous, continuous roar that made thought impossible. The sky filled with black puffs of exploding shells, flak blossoming like deadly flowers. 40mm Bofors guns joined in, their slower, heavier rhythm adding bass notes to the symphony of violence. 20mm Oerlikons chattered maniacally, tracers drawing red lines across the blue. The Japanese came on anyway. They flew into that storm of steel with a calmness that seemed inhuman. Planes disintegrated mid-flight, torn apart by direct hits. Others shuddered and fell, trailing fire and smoke. But for every plane that fell, 3 more pressed forward. Lieutenant Fletcher's Wildcat screamed past a Betty at 300 knots, guns hammering. He saw his rounds punch holes through the bomber's fuselage, saw the rear gunner slump forward. But the Betty kept flying, kept lining up its torpedo run. Fletcher hauled his stick hard right, trying for another pass, but a Zero dropped on him from above, cannons flashing. His windscreen shattered. Something hot punched through his shoulder. The Wildcat rolled, dove, Fletcher fighting the controls with one good arm while blood soaked his flight suit. On the Denver, Gunner Jackson saw the first torpedo hit the water, a white splash 2,000 yards out. Then another. Another. Silver fish running just beneath the surface, aimed straight at the heart of the formation. Torpedoes in the water! The lookout screamed unnecessarily. Everyone could see them now. Briscoe gripped the railing, knuckles white. Hard right rudder. All ahead flank. The cruiser heaved into a sharp turn, deck tilting 30 degrees, men grabbing for handholds. The torpedoes raced closer, 130 feet of destruction moving at 46 knots, too fast to outrun. Only hope was to turn inside their turning radius. One passed down the port side, missing by 15 feet. Close enough that sailors on deck could see its wake, could see the sunlight gleaming off its bronze propellers. But across the formation, the destroyer Brownson wasn't as lucky. The torpedo struck amidships, right at the waterline. The explosion lifted the destroyer's midsection 10 feet out of the water, breaking her back like a toy. She settled immediately, hull cracking, seawater pouring into ruptured compartments. Men leaped from her decks into burning oil. Briscoe watched through his binoculars, face stone. 300 men on that ship. Maybe half would make it off. The bombers wheeled for another run. The sky had transformed into a living nightmare, a swirling chaos of smoke, fire, and screaming metal where up and down lost all meaning. Aboard the Denver, Captain Briscoe braced himself against the bridge railing as another stick of bombs straddled his ship, geysers of white water erupting 200 feet into the air. The cascading spray soaked the forward deck, washing away blood from where a fragment had caught a signalman across the face. Damage control reports flooding in compartment 37 Charlie. Morrison shouted over the cacophony. Pumps are holding. Briscoe didn't respond. He was tracking the next wave of attackers. 6 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers rolling into their attack runs, pulling into near-vertical climbs before flipping over and plunging earthward like hunting hawks. Beautiful, in a terrible way. Graceful as ballet dancers. Deadly as cancer. The 5-inch guns couldn't track targets that steep. Too fast, too close. That's what the Bofors were for. 40mm cruise, targets vertical. The gunnery officer screamed into his comm, lead them. Led them. The Bofors gunners cranked their mounts skyward, feeding belts of ammunition into hungry receivers. The guns hammered out their distinctive pom-pom-pom rhythm, shell casings raining on the deck in musical cascades. Tracers climbed toward the diving valves, reaching, searching, connecting. One bomber exploded mid-dive, a direct hit to its bomb load. The blast was so violent that pieces of the aircraft rained down across half a mile of ocean. The bomb it had been carrying detonated in mid-air, the shock wave rippling outward in a perfect sphere of compressed atmosphere. But the other 5 kept coming. Gunner Jackson swung his mount frantically, tracking the lead Val as it dropped through 3,000 feet, 2,000, 1,500. He could see the pilot now, could see the dark shape of the man's helmet, the glint off his goggles. The Japanese pilot held steady, unwavering, ignoring the hurricane of fire rising to meet him. "Come on, you son of a bitch, come on." Jackson muttered, finger locked on the trigger, rounds pouring upward in a steady stream. The Val shuddered. Smoke streamed from its engine. But it didn't pull up. At 800 feet, the bomb separated from the aircraft, a dark egg tumbling through space, fins stabilizing, nose pointing down with terrible inevitability. Jackson stopped firing. No point. That bomb was already on its way. The Val pulled up hard, or tried to. But the damage was too severe. The aircraft stalled, flipped onto its back, and corkscrewed into the sea half a mile off the port beam. The impact sent up a column of water that hung in the air for 3 seconds before collapsing back into the Pacific. The bomb struck the water 30 feet from the Denver's port quarter. The underwater detonation lifted the stern 6 feet, slamming every man on board into whatever was closest: steel bulkheads, deck plates, instruments. In the engine room, Chief Machinist's mate Rodriguez felt his teeth crack as his face hit a pressure gauge. He tasted blood, spat, and kept working, hands moving on autopilot to adjust throttle settings even as his vision swam with stars. Briscoe pulled himself upright, ears ringing. Damage report. Stern compartments report minor flooding, no fires. Morrison called back, blood running from his nose but still functional. Rudder still answers. Screws still turning. Still in the fight. That's all that mattered. But the Brownson was gone, slipped beneath the waves in less than 4 minutes, leaving only debris and men struggling in the oily water. The destroyer Spence broke formation to begin rescue operations, circling the survivors while her guns kept firing skyward. Overhead, Lieutenant Fletcher's Wildcat limped through the chaos, hydraulics failing, fuel streaming from punctured tanks. His shoulder felt like someone had jammed a blowtorch into the socket, and every breath brought fresh agony. But his gun sight still worked, and there were still Japanese planes in his sky. A Betty bomber crossed his nose, low and slow, setting up for another torpedo run. Fletcher didn't think. Didn't aim carefully. Just yanked the stick over and held the trigger down, walking his rounds across the bomber's starboard wing. The wing folded. Just crumpled, structural failure instantaneous and catastrophic. The Betty cartwheeled into the ocean at 200 miles per hour, the impact so violent that pieces bounced back into the air. "Blue 2, this is Blue Leader," Fletcher gasped into his radio. "I'm hit bad. Fuel's critical. Heading for the barn." The barn was the carrier Essex, 70 miles southeast. He'd never make it. They both knew it. "But you didn't say that on the radio." "Roger, Blue Leader," came Ensign Reeves' voice, tight with suppressed emotion. "We'll keep the door open." Fletcher turned south, nursing his dying fighter, watching the fuel gauge drop with terrifying speed. Behind him, the battle raged on without him. It always did. Men died, and the battle kept going. On the Denver, the gun crews were operating in a semi-autonomous state. Load, fire, traverse, load, fire, traverse. Their conscious minds shut down, running on training and muscle memory. Shell casings piled up in brass mountains around each mount. The deck was slick with hydraulic fluid and blood and seawater. Men's ears bled from overpressure. But the guns kept singing. A Zero fighter made the mistake of strafing the cruiser's superstructure, coming in low and fast. 17 20mm Oerlikons tracked it simultaneously. The fighter disintegrated, simply ceased to exist as a coherent object, transformed into a cloud of shredded metal and vaporized fuel that drifted across the water like industrial snow. But while the Zero died, 3 more valves punched through the flak umbrella. They came from different angles. Doctrine designed to split defensive fire, force impossible choices. One from ahead, one from starboard, one from directly astern. 3 bombs, 3 trajectories, 3 chances to kill. Evasive maneuvers. Briscoe roared. Hard left. The helmsman spun the wheel, tendons standing out on his forearms. The Denver heeled into the turn, but cruisers weren't destroyers. They didn't pivot like sports cars. The turn was agonizingly slow. The first bomb missed ahead by 100 feet. The second hit the water off the starboard bow, close enough that shrapnel peppered the forward superstructure. Men ducked behind inadequate steel, praying to gods they'd forgotten until this moment. The third bomb, the one from astern, struck perfectly. It hit the fantail, punching through the deck armor like tissue paper, detonating in the aft berthing compartment. 32 men died instantly, crushed by overpressure, incinerated by flash, shredded by fragmentation. The compartment simply ceased to exist, replaced by a cavity of twisted metal and rising smoke. The Denver shuddered, slowed. Secondary explosions rippled through aft sections as ready ammunition cooked off. "Fire in aft berthing!" Morrison screamed. "Fire in the steering gear room!" Briscoe felt the ship listing to port. Not severe yet, but worsening. "Damage control teams aft. Seal those compartments. Counterflood to correct list." Down in the bowels of the ship, men raced through smoke-filled passageways, dragging hoses, hauling extinguishers, knowing that every second mattered. Ensign Parker, fresh from Annapolis, led a team into the flames, foam spraying, eyes burning, lungs screaming. They found bodies, twisted, charred things that had been shipmates an hour ago. They kept moving. The steering gear room was flooding, seawater pouring through cracked hull plates. If they lost steering, the Denver would circle aimlessly, a perfect target. "Get those pumps working!" Parker shouted. "Rig emergency steering!" They worked in darkness, by feel, water rising past their ankles, then their knees. The ship groaned around them, metal crying out in agony. On the bridge, Briscoe watched the Japanese formation reforming, preparing for another run. He counted the remaining attackers. 18 planes left. His task force had already lost one destroyer sunk, another badly damaged. The cruiser Montpelier was trailing oil, one engine offline. His own ship was wounded, bleeding from her stern. And the Japanese were coming back. "Sir, the Spence reports they've recovered 47 survivors from Brownson," Morrison reported, voice hollow. 253 still missing. Briscoe closed his eyes for 1 second. 253. Boys from farm towns and big cities, men with wives and girlfriends and mothers who'd get telegrams in 3 weeks. "Signal the Spence," he said quietly. "Resume station. We're not done yet." The radio man hesitated. "Sir, they're still pulling men from the water." "I know what they're doing, sailor," Briscoe snapped. "And if they don't rejoin formation, they'll be the next ship turned into a life raft convention. Resume station. Now." The order went out. The Spence reluctantly abandoned the search, leaving men in life jackets to watch their rescuer sail away. Some would be picked up later. Most wouldn't. The Pacific was a big ocean, and the sharks were patient. Above the task force, the remaining Wildcats were down to their last ammunition. Ensign Reeves squeezed off his final burst at a Betty, saw smoke trail from its engine, knew it wasn't enough. His guns clicked empty. He was officially a spectator. "All Blue flight aircraft, this is Blue 2, he transmitted. "Winchester." "Repeat." "Winchester." Returning to base. Returning to a carrier deck, he could barely see through the smoke and haze. If he even made it that far. The Japanese bombers lined up for their final assault, everything they had left, one massive coordinated strike designed to overwhelm the damaged American formation. 18 aircraft converging from multiple vectors, torpedoes and bombs ready, pilots knowing this was their last chance. On the Denver, Captain Briscoe stood at the bridge window and watched death approaching. The list was worsening despite counter-flooding. Fires still burned aft. His steering was sluggish, unresponsive. Half his crew was fighting damage below decks. But his guns still worked. "All batteries," he said into the comm, voice steady as granite. "This is the captain. They're coming in for the kill. I need every gun singing. I need every round in the air. And I need you to understand something. We don't quit. We don't surrender. We make them pay for every goddamn foot of water between them and us. Do you hear me?" Through bulkheads and decks, across every gun mount and fire control station, men heard. And answered. The guns roared their reply. The Japanese came like a tidal wave of metal and fire, 18 aircraft converging from 8 different compass points, a textbook hammer and anvil formation designed to make defensive fire meaningless. Aboard the Denver, every gun that could still traverse swiveled toward the nearest threat, but there were too many angles, too many attackers. Mathematics dictated the impossible. You cannot defend everywhere at once. Captain Briscoe made his choice. "Concentrate all fire on the torpedo bombers," he commanded, voice cutting through the chaos with surgical precision. "The dive bombers will hurt us. The torpedoes will kill us. Choose." The fire control officers adjusted their priorities instantly. The 5-inch gun swung toward the low-flying Bettys and Nells skimming the wave tops, torpedoes visible as dark cylinders beneath their bellies. The Beauforts and Oerlikons would have to handle the dive bombers alone. It was triage. Brutal, necessary, mathematical. Gunner Jackson's mount tracked a Betty bomber racing in at 50 feet above the water, so low its prop wash was kicking up spray. His loader, a kid named Hernandez from San Antonio, fed the belt with mechanical efficiency despite hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Steady," Jackson muttered, more to himself than his crew. "Steady, lead him, lead him." He fired. The 40mm rounds walked across the water in explosive splashes, climbing toward the Betty, connecting. The bomber's starboard engine exploded in a gout of orange flame. The aircraft yawed hard right, out of control, and slammed into the ocean at full throttle. The torpedo detonated on impact, sending a column of water and vaporized aluminum 200 feet into the air. "Got him!" Hernandez screamed. "We got the bastard!" But Jackson was already traversing to the next target. There was always a next target. 3 more Bettys broke through the defensive fire, releasing their torpedoes at point-blank range, less than 1,000 yards. The Silver Fish hit the water running, wakes aerostraight, tracking toward the wounded cruiser with mechanical certainty. "Torpedoes port side," the lookout screamed. "Multiple fish in the water." Briscoe didn't hesitate. "Hard right rudder. All engines ahead, emergency flank." Down in the engine room, Chief Rodriguez watched his temperature gauges climb into the red. The turbines were screaming, a high-pitched whine that meant metal was degrading, bearings were failing, that they were burning operational years off the machinery for minutes of extra speed. He didn't care. Dead engines didn't matter if you were dead. "Give me everything she's got," Rodriguez roared at his team. "Feed those boilers. Now." The Denver surged forward, heeling hard into the turn. But she was wounded, listing, slower than she should be. The torpedoes adjusted course, tracking, closing. 1,500 yards. 1,200. 900. On deck, men who couldn't fire guns, couldn't steer, couldn't do anything but watch, gripped the railings and prayed. Some prayed to God. Some to wives whose names they whispered like incantations. Some to luck, or fate, or mathematics. 600 yards. The first torpedo passed down the port side, missing by 30 feet, close enough that men felt the compression wave through the hull. The second diverged, running wild, its gyroscope knocked offline by impact with the water. But the third one tracked true. Briscoe saw it coming, a white wake running straight as judgment toward the forward quarter of his ship. No time to turn further. No room for miracles. "Brace for impact," he shouted. "All hands, brace." The torpedo struck just aft of the forward turret, below the waterline, punching through the hull and detonating in the forward magazine handling room. 600 pounds of high explosive released their energy in a millisecond, creating a gas bubble that expanded at hypersonic velocity. The forward third of the Denver lifted out of the water. Briscoe felt the deck leap beneath his feet, felt the entire bridge structure rise and twist. Men were thrown against bulkheads, instruments shattered, glass exploded inward. The helmsman's head cracked against the wheel with a sound like a baseball bat hitting concrete. He collapsed, blood spreading across the deck in a dark pool. The explosion tore a hole 20 feet across in the cruiser's hull. Forward compartments flooded instantly. A-deck berthing, the forward head, damage control central. Watertight doors slammed shut automatically, sealing men inside to drown in darkness. Their screams echoed through the voice tubes for 30 seconds before the water took them. Lieutenant Morrison pulled himself upright, blood streaming from a gash across his forehead. Forward compartments 1 through 5 report flooding. Fire in the forward magazine. Fire. In a magazine. The two words that meant certain death. Flood the forward magazines. Briscoe ordered, his voice hoarse. Emergency flooding. Do it now. Deep in the ship's bowels, damage control teams spun valves, deliberately flooding compartments to prevent the stacked ammunition from cooking off. Water poured in, thousands of gallons per minute, racing the fire, trying to drown it before it reached the shells that would turn the Denver into a floating funeral pyre. The cruiser settled by the bow, down 10 degrees, then 15. Water surged through ruptured compartments, finding every crack, every seam. The list to port worsened. On the bridge, Briscoe gripped the chart table to stay upright. His ship was dying beneath him. He could feel it in the way she moved, sluggish and heavy, like a wounded animal trying to crawl to shelter. But overhead, the dive bombers were rolling in. 6 Aichi Vals, plunging from 8,000 feet in screaming dives, their fixed landing gear looking like talons extended for the kill. Without the 5-inch guns, now trained uselessly at the water as the deck tilted, the Beaufort's crews were the only defense. They fired anyway. 40-millimeter rounds climbed toward the diving aircraft, creating a lattice of fire and steel. One Val shuddered, pulled up short, bomb tumbling harmlessly into the sea. Another took hits to the engine, smoke trailing, but held its dive. At 2,000 feet, the bombs began to fall. Jackson tracked one bomb all the way down, a dark shape growing larger, impossibly fast. He swung his mount, fired, knowing it was useless but unable not to try. The bomb passed so close he could see the Japanese characters stenciled on its side. It hit the water 5 feet from the starboard beam. The near-miss detonation was almost worse than a direct hit. The underwater blast created a hammer of water pressure that slammed into the cruiser's side, buckling plates, springing rivets, opening seams that had held for years. More water poured in, starboard side now, balancing the port list but worsening the overall flooding. Another bomb struck the aft superstructure directly, punching through the deck and detonating in the officer's wardroom. The compartment ceased to exist. 6 officers playing cards while waiting for their duty shift died before their hands hit the table. The blast tore through 2 more decks, opening the ship to the sky. Ensign Parker, still fighting fires below, felt the deck buck beneath him. The blast wave threw him 15 feet down a passageway. He hit a bulkhead hard enough to crack ribs, landing in water that was now waist-deep and rising. "Abandon the lower decks," he gasped into his radio. "Get everyone topside. We're losing her." Topside, the Denver was a chaos of smoke, flame, and flooding. Men emerged from hatches like souls escaping hell, coughing, burned, bleeding. Some carried wounded shipmates. Some were alone. All wore the same expression, the 1,000-yard stare of men who'd seen the face of death and barely turned away. Briscoe watched his crew spilling onto the weather decks and made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Signal the task force," he said quietly. "Request immediate assistance. Prepare to abandon ship." Morrison stared at him. "Sir." "Look at her, Lieutenant." Briscoe's voice was steady, terribly calm. Forward magazines flooded. 2 torpedo hits, multiple bomb hits. Fire in 4 compartments. Flooding in 9. We've got maybe 20 minutes before she rolls. I won't kill the crew to save the ship. Not when the ship's already dead. Morrison's throat worked. He nodded. "Aye, sir." The signal went out across the task force. Denver requesting immediate assistance. Preparing to abandon. The destroyer Aulick broke formation, racing toward the dying cruiser at 35 knots, her captain knowing every minute counted. The Japanese aircraft, their ordnance expended, formed up and headed northeast toward Rabaul, trailing smoke and missing 6 of their number. They'd leave the ocean to finish what they'd started. Aboard the Denver, men began launching life rafts, securing lines, helping wounded shipmates toward the rails. The ship settled lower, bow pointing at the ocean floor 2,000 feet below. Her list increased, 20 degrees, 25. In the engine room, Chief Rodriguez and his team received the abandoned ship order and stared at each other in disbelief. Leave their engines? Their babies? You heard the order, Rodriguez said finally, voice thick. Secure the plant. Bring her down safe. We don't leave her burning. They worked with tears streaming down their soot-blackened faces, shutting down systems, closing valves, making sure their engines died with dignity. When the last gauge read 0, Rodriguez pressed his palm against a turbine casing that was still warm and whispered, "Sorry, girl." Then they ran for their lives. Topside, Captain Briscoe stood on his tilting bridge and watched his crew going over the side. One by one, groups of 3 and 4, helping each other, no panic, no screaming. Discipline holding even now. He'd never been prouder. Lieutenant Morrison appeared at his elbow. "Sir, the crew's clear. Time to go." Briscoe looked at the young officer. "You first, son." "Sir, regulations state." "I know what the regulations state. I'll be right behind you." "Go." Morrison hesitated, then nodded. He climbed through the bridge window and dropped to the deck below, then over the side into the oil-slicked water. Briscoe stood alone on the bridge of his dying ship. The Denver groaned, a deep, terrible sound of breaking metal and flooding compartments. She rolled another 5 degrees. He could stay. The old tradition. Go down with the ship. Romantic. Stupid. His crew needed him alive, to testify at the inquiry, to make sure their sacrifices were remembered, to write letters to 253 families explaining how their sons had died. Briscoe took one last look around his bridge, the shattered instruments, the blood-stained deck, the wheel where men had steered his ship through 1,000 miles of ocean. Then he climbed out the window and dropped into the Pacific. The Denver rolled onto her beam ends 5 minutes later, hung there for an eternal moment, then slipped beneath the surface with a sound like the world sighing. She took 47 men with her, trapped below, wounded, unable to escape. Their names would be added to the list. Destroyer Aulick pulled 386 survivors from the water over the next hour. Captain Briscoe was one of the last, hauled aboard by sailors who treated him with quiet reverence. He stood on the Aulick's deck, wrapped in a blanket, watching oil burn on the water where his ship had died. Around him floated debris, life jackets, wooden planks, a single shoe, things that had been part of a warship and were now just flotsam. In the distance, smoke still rose from where the Brownson had gone down. 7 miles away, the Montpelier limped south, trailing oil, escorted by destroyers. The task force had been savaged. 2 ships sunk, 2 damaged, over 400 men dead or missing. But the Japanese had lost 18 aircraft and their crews. No one had won. They'd both just lost.